Hi, I'm Jerry Gross. To give you a little bit of my history, I was born in South Omaha, to be precise, 25th and E. My dad had a grocery store on 24th and E. I was, back in those days, and I'm going back a long ways and a long time, hospitals were a luxury. To be born in a hospital was a luxury that my parents couldn't afford, and most of the contemporaries couldn't afford. I was delivered by a midwife, as were my two older brothers in the same house. I think I was about 5 when my dad turned his grocery over to a brother-in-law because he had the opportunity to become a partner in a grocery store on the north side. We moved to what was called the Saratoga District, 25th and Fowler, 26th and Fowler. And my dad became a partner with his brother-in-law, Rube Kulikowski, in a very active, prosperous grocery, our Kulikowski Company on 24th and Ames Avenue. It was a real hub in those days. The streetcar had one of I think two of their big barns there with the trolley cars, and there was conductors and motormen and workmen 24 hours a day. There was a drugstore on the corner, my dad's grocery next door, a bakery, Max I. Walker. His stores are still well known here in Omaha, but his first store was right there on that intersection. Saratoga Grade School was on one of the corners. And then there was the regular business district, a dry goods store, a small bank, even a theater, North Star Theater, all gone now. In fact, I was out to that intersection a few years ago to show a grandchild where I had grown up, and it looks like, well, like present-day Beirut, I guess. It was a disaster. Empty buildings, boarded up windows. My grandson couldn't believe, Grandpa, this is where you grew up? But in those days, it was a nice middle-class neighborhood. And my dad is one of the merchants. We had a certain prestige in the neighborhood. It was a working-class neighborhood, primarily Catholic. In fact, I started Saratoga School, and I was one of only 2 Jewish students in the it was an 8th grade school. The other person was a daughter of an Omaha family, the Goodbinders, who I think are still here in Omaha, although I've lost touch.
Jerry, let's go back and
Yes.
What year were you born in?
1916. Should I throw that in there? And we moved, as I say, when I was 5, so 1921. Not too many people remember those days. But we were observant Jews. We didn't go overboard. We were not what you would term Orthodox, but we were observant. We were members of the synagogue on 18th in Chicago, where my grandfather was very active. In fact, I think he was president or whatever the top person was there for a while. And on Friday nights, we'd get in the Studebaker touring car, and my mother would drive down to her dad's meat market, the Abraham Mushkin Meat Market on 24th and Charles. And that was one of my best memories, because Grandpa would give us all, it would be with my 2 brothers, he'd give us all a big hello, and then he'd go in the back room where he had boiling briskets in a big copper boiler over a 2-plate gas stove. And he'd spear one of those briskets, cut off a big healthy chunk, and there we'd have that real hot corned beef. And of all the things I remember in the meat market, that's what I remember. Mother would get her week's supply of meat, then we'd get in the Studebaker touring and back home. I worked in the store, as did my brothers, putting up pecks of potatoes. Potatoes would come in great big gunny sacks. You'd dump 3 or 4 gunny sacks in a corner there, then you'd sit on a stool and you'd put them up, I think, in 10-pound paper bags. Then you'd tie them in preparation for the sale days, which was the next day, Saturday. We were closed Sunday, and Saturday was the day that the carmen got paid, and it was a payday for most people in those days. That was their weekly paycheck. So Saturday was the big grocery day. Then we'd put up sugar. And of course there was no air conditioning. Sugar would be put in a big drawer in one of the counters. Then you'd take a scoop and you'd scoop it into a heavy craft paper bag, 10 pounds, and it was a hot, sticky work, and it was terrible. In the summer, no air conditioning, and here you were scooping up that sugar, and it would stick to your arms and to your face. It was miserable. Grinding coffee wasn't too bad. We had 2 grades of coffee. You wouldn't believe the price. One was 29 cents a pound, and the other was 39 cents a pound. And we had an electric grinder, and you'd grind the coffee. It would come out ground into a little can that was below the chute. Then you'd put it in 1-pound bags, tie it with string. There was a paper tape machine, but as I recall, those things were tied with string. And then that was preparation for the Saturday. Pounds of coffee were wrapped, 10 pounds of sugar, pecks of potatoes, and there was another job that had to get ready for Saturday. Eggs came in a rather large crate, 30 dozen, 2 sections of 15 dozen each. And we had paper cartons, not quite the nice compartmentalized cartons that we have today, but a wood carton that would hold 12 eggs. We'd put 12 eggs in each carton. The customer would buy a wood carton of 12 eggs and then return the carton. Or sometimes they owned the carton. They'd bring in an empty and we'd fill it with 12 eggs or whatever. But as I got a little older, I had a rather artistic bent. So one of my jobs was to take some whiting, which looked like flour, but it's actually fine ground chalk, mix it with a little water and vinegar, and paint signs on the glass front windows. I'd get a stool and I'd special today, peck of potatoes, 39 cents, cigarettes, 2 packs for $0.25, or some of them I remember, but I'd put in the specials for the day. The store was in a 2-story building. The upper floor was occupied by the North Omaha Booster, a weekly freely distributed paper. And the salesman was Dave Blacker, another familiar name in Jewish Omaha. And we were his big customer. The store was his big customer. I don't know, I might have been about 10 years old when Dad bought out Rube Kulikowski, who had gone in partnership with 2 of his brothers and opened up the Central Market in downtown Omaha. And so then it became the J.A. Gross Grocery. But my duties, they were the same: put up potatoes, pack sugar, paint the windows. But my brothers also, my brother Gordon, 4 years older, my brother Elmer, 8 years older, they all had their duties too. But by that time I was old enough, I had an added duty. As customers would come in and buy a 48-pound bag of flour and these other items, potatoes and sugar and groceries, canned and fresh vegetables, then I had to help them take it out to the car. They might be parked a block away. And so I'd throw the bag of flour over my shoulder and the potatoes under one arm and the sugar under another arm and walk a block or two, maybe even more, to help the customer with the big purchase. The big purchase in those days, if they'd spent $20, boy, that was exciting. But that was the grocery business in those days. Then, of course, I graduated, got out of elementary school, out of Saratoga, and started it at Central High School. There was a North High School, which was much closer, and very new. It had been built not only a few years before I got out of 8th grade. And it was a lovely school, but I don't know if there was any Jewish students there. I don't know. If any, there were very few. Central was the place to go. It was a college preparatory, and where most of the Jewish graduates from 8th grade were all going to Central High, so I wanted to be with my friends, some of whom I'd met in Sunday school and so forth, so I wanted to go to Central too. That required a streetcar. Every student didn't own a car in those days. So, but it was no big deal. There was streetcars right on 24th Street that would take me right downtown and drop me off right beside Central High School. So at Central, I took the regular courses for freshmen, and then now we're getting up to year about, let's see, I was a freshman and sophomore. My dad made an investment in a creamery on 19th, between 18th and 19th and Izzard. The building is still there, but I don't know what type of business is in it at the moment. But this had to be back in about 1932. He bought a half interest with a Gentile gentleman by the name of Barnaby in a creamery. The name was Middle States Creamery, and their products were called Midas. They made butter, Midas butter, and Midas cheese, some of which they shipped to New York by boxcar, and others was distributed and sold in the Omaha groceries and restaurants and so forth. But here, at maybe 14 years old, 15 years old, a freshman in Central High School, and my dad owned a creamery only 10, 12 blocks from school. As you can imagine, I was a very popular guy. After school, I'd always have 3, 4 friends. We'd walk down to the creamery, which was just, as I say, maybe 19th and Izzard, maybe 10 blocks. And we'd go into the flavoring room where there was ground nuts and maraschino cherries, just buckets of them, and we'd help ourselves. Then we'd go into the room where they were pouring the ice cream. I can remember I used to have a hankering on vanilla ice cream with maraschino cherries. I'd stuff so many maraschino cherries into a quart container of soft vanilla ice cream that it looked like bricks with a little mortar in between it. But that was my pleasure. My dad was a partner in the place. Nobody dared say anything to me. Then came a little disaster. He had been in the business maybe 2 years. We're now up to probably 1934. There was a milk strike. The farmers who had been bringing the milk into Omaha went on a strike. And they wanted more money for their milk. There was big creameries. The one that my dad had an interest in was one of the smaller ones, but there was the Fairmont and Harding, and they were big firms requiring tremendous amounts of milk. But not they're there for about a month. No milk was allowed to enter Omaha. It was very simple in those days. There was only maybe half a dozen roads, thoroughfares that led into Omaha. There was one or two from the east and west, and one or two from the north and south. So to blockade the roads didn't require a lot of effort on the part of the farmers. If a person came along, and in those days the milk was in, I don't know the size of the can, but large, what we termed milk cans, they were maybe 3 foot high, probably contained 25 gallons of milk. But if a truck came along with milk to come in Omaha, the person manning the blockade for that day would merely take off the cans and pour the milk in the gutter. This went on for at least a month and presented a big problem. Some of the workers in the creamery were skilled. You can't just lay them off, because hopefully you're going to start up the next day or the next or the next, and you can't readily call them back. So I'd go down to the creamery, not a single motor was going, the churns were not churning, and the presses were not pressing, and it was a desolate place. The workmen who had been kept on the payroll were sitting there playing cards. I'd go up to my dad's office, and he was worried sick. And they had meetings. Dad would be at a meeting with the other creamery owners and interested people in milk products. And he'd come home, well, I think maybe tomorrow they might reach an agreement. But tomorrow and then tomorrow and tomorrow. It went on for at least a month. Finally, he came home and said, I think we've got it resolved. And sure enough, the following day, the blockade was lifted and the milk started rolling in. It was, things looked bright, but that lasted only a few weeks, and then boom, it happened again. As I recall, Robert's Dairy, who in a slightly different form is still around today. But in those days, that was the big fluid milk company in Omaha. They were down on 29th and Cumming, a big dairy. They themselves had quite a herd, but they bought probably the great majority of their milk and had been affected by the strike. So they broke the pact, and the blockade was on again. And this time, the Middle States Creamery went bankrupt. I mentioned that my dad had what in those days they termed nervous breakdown over the bankruptcy of the creamery, but we were not, we didn't have to go on welfare or anything. We lost money, or he lost money, but we got along just fine. We still had the grocery store, which he had not given up, and he eventually got better and spent the later years of his life with my sister Ed and Sally Malashok. But he was the youngest in a large family, the Grosses. There were 7 siblings. They had emigrated from Russia, I don't know just where, but from Russia. The 6 older children had immigrated, and Dad, my father, the youngest of the bunch, was born here, I think in Omaha, in Omaha. Some of his older siblings are names that have stayed around Omaha. The oldest one, his brother Bernie, ran a grocery store in a small suburb in South Omaha. The name escapes me. Then Lena Myers married Ernie Myers, who was a wholesale vegetable merchant in the old market. In fact, there's a building right across from the French Cafe. If you look at the very top cornerstone, it still has the name E. Myers. That was the location of his wholesale fruit company. Another of the Gross family there was, let's see, who came next in line there? Sam Gross. He had originally been a fireman in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Then he bought a small grocery store on Broadway. And it was a little offbeat grocery store. He dealt mostly in salvage goods from train wrecks or trucks that had turned over and maybe the cans were dented or the labels scratched. And he had a store that I think he also had some regular groceries, but it was the place to go for a little of the offbeat grocery items at a real discount. My dad, and then his, oh gosh, I've lost track of Katsky, Tony Katsky was a sister, married my Uncle Abe Katsky, who he worked in the Central Market as a clerk. She's best known. Aunt Tony survived him, of course, and went on to live. She died at 101. The longest living relative that not only I've had, but I've ever heard of, actually. Well, no. Honey Kay came along here recently, 107. My mother also came from a large family. She had 7 siblings. She was the next to the oldest. There was 5 girls and 2 sons. Her older sister, Susie, married Sam Kaplan, who had the Omaha Hat Factory and later Supercraft Garment downtown Omaha. Then my mother. Then next was Rose, her sister Rose, who married Harry Malashok, who at the time owned the Malashok Jewelry Store on 16th and Farnham. And the Malashok Jewelry still exists it passed on to his brother Jake and is now being operated by Jake's, or Jay as he was known, by his grandchildren. First his son Bob, and now his grandchildren. And then next in line was Art Muskin. He and the other son dropped the H in the name, and the Mushkin became Muskin. Art was a salesman for a large coal company, and he handled some big accounts. He was a salesman extraordinaire. I think he sold the coal to the Omaha Public Power and some of the bigger dealers. Next in line came Sister Hannah. She was married to Ben Tatel, who worked as a furniture salesman at Hartman Furniture Company, which was a large building next door, just south of the Orpheum Theater. Hannah died very young. Ben moved east and remarried, and I did see him a few times in his second marriage when we had gone east to New York. But he and his second wife are both gone now. And then next was the sister Grace. She married Max Simon, who at the time had a grocery store in Council Bluffs, also called the Central Market. But in later years, he ran the meat department in Phillips Department Store in South Omaha. And they had two children. One is a doctor in Seattle. The other was Stuart Simon, who also went into the wholesale meat business with one of his cousins, Irv Simon, who is now deceased, but Stuart is still alive, living at the Remington here in Omaha. Then Nathan, my mother's brother Nathan Muskin, who was better known as Doc. He was the only child that had gone on to college and even into graduate school and become a doctor. And married very late in life. His widow is still alive and living in the Swanson Towers. We see her occasionally. I saw her as recently as a week ago. And that pretty much covers my parents. My brothers, I had a brother Gordon, 4 years older than myself. He was in the insurance business most of his adult life. He married Lucille Krasny from the People's Department Store in Council Bluffs. And from that marriage, they had two children, two daughters. One, Sandy Martin, still lives here in Omaha. The older of the girls, Frankie, moved to California and is happily married there. Gordon was in the insurance business. He worked for H.A. Wolf Company, and then in their insurance department. And then came a time, I'm just trying to think of the general time, must have been in the 60s. H.A. Wolf wanted to dispose of the insurance department. So Gordon and Arnold Yaffe and Paul Goldstein bought the department and started an agency of their own. And that prospered. They got along fine for quite a few years, but then Arnold and Paul decided to go off on their own agency, while my brother Gordon teamed up with a gentleman with the name Bush, and they had the Gross Bush Agency in a building just east of the Venice Inn, about 73rd and Pacific. And he operated that insurance agency until his death in 1987. Elmer, my older brother Elmer, 8 years older than me, he continued to run the grocery store, my dad's grocery store on 24th and Ames, for quite a few years, through the war years and all. And then he had an opportunity to build some apartment buildings with Sam Stern. They built some duplexes, and it was very successful. Then that partnership parted up very amicably, but Elmer decided he wanted to build residences, and he went off on his own, just practically a one-man construction company. As he got jobs, he would hire the various necessary crews, and he built a great many of the houses in what was called Dillon's Fair Acres. Basically, it's from about 60th, about 60th to about 65th or so on Underwood Avenue, and from Underwood Avenue north to Western. That was called Dillon's Fair Acres. It had been developed by a builder by the name of Bob Dillon. And he took a liking to Elmer and made a deal with him one time that he would sign over 20 lots. They were just beginning the development. There was really no houses there, I don't think any at all. It had been just farmland. And he signed over 20 lots and gave him title to it. And all Elmer had to do was give him a note that he owed him the money for the 20 lots and would pay him when he had the money. And with the ownership of those 20 lots, he was able to get the financing to build houses, which is what Bob Dylan wanted, to get someone to get started building on this development, to get it started, to start rolling. So with the title to those lots, Elmer was able to get the financing and started building, and a great many. I'm just giving a wild guess. He built a house for Pearl and I, but I would say that he built 50 houses in Dillon's Fair Acres. Many of them are Jewish people who we would know, who are friends of his, friends of mine, and they were all very happy. He had a wonderful reputation. They would come to me and tell me that not only did he do everything he promised, he would even do more. So that kind of covers, as for my business experience.
Let's go back and talk about high school.
All right. Well, I just about covered high school when I told you that it was a short walk to my dad's creamery until the creamery folded up. But I graduated Central and went on, as did most of my contemporaries, to the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And that's where most of the Omaha Central High graduates, a few went to more distant colleges, but University of Omaha was satisfied most of us. There I joined the ZBT fraternity, and after 2 years there, my dad, as I had mentioned previously, had suffered a nervous breakdown, and it was decided that for his health reasons he should travel. That in the winter he should go down to Brownville, Texas, and spend the winter there, and then in the summer he could come back up here to Omaha. That this would be good for his condition. He would improve more rapidly. So I wanted to be back in Omaha, and I transferred to the University of Omaha. Right now it's called UNO. It's connected with the University of Nebraska. It's their Omaha campus. But in those days it was an independent university. It consisted of three buildings on 24th and Sprague Street in Omaha. And I stayed most of those years with my aunt and uncle Kaplans, Susie Kaplan and my uncle Sam Kaplan, where at that time their son Ed was still home. Laser was he was going to the University of Iowa, and Howard, at that time, he was also at Central High and then later went on to the University of Nebraska. But I lived there while I was going to the University of Omaha. After that, I went to work for a insurance company as an adjuster. It was the Connecticut Health and Accident Company, and I officed in the Omaha National Bank building on 17th and Douglas. And as I jokingly tell my grandchildren when they ask about my business history, I quit that job for reasons of health. I was starving to death. Because at that time, I'm now up to about 1938, and I had gotten married to Omaha's prettiest girl. Pearl Ossoff, who was also a Central High graduate and was working for the magnificent sum of $9 a week as a secretary to Max Barish at the Barish Auto Company on about 25th and Farnham. I think, as I recall, they were the dealers of Dodge and Chrysler cars. And she was the secretary. I kid her about it, $9 a week. I don't think her grandchildren would work for that, nor $9 an hour. But we were married, and we moved into an apartment which, fortunately, my dad owned, and as a wedding gift gave us a 1 year's free rent, the Glen Arlo apartment, which is still standing and still in good shape on the corner of 51st and Capitol Avenue. And we had a very nice little apartment there. Then we had our first child, our daughter Andy Jean, while we were living at the Glen Arlo there. And I'm now up to 1940.
I want to go back a little bit and
All
talk
right.
about how you met Pearl.
How I met Pearl? Well, at Central High School. It's interesting how I met Pearl. I mentioned I was at Central, and at the time, I was a senior, and I was... Central had, I don't know if they still use this system, but at that time, they had an odd system of you would run for your classes. If you wanted this particular teacher, you had to line them up so the popular teachers, they would get a full class very rapidly. So you had to figure out that I'll go here first and then here second, and figure out your schedule in that manner. And I ran for a modern problems class taught by Frank Nappel, who I knew because he was also the basketball coach, and I had played freshman basketball for him. And he was coach, and I was Jerry, and everything was very cozy. So he taught modern problems, so I ran for his class, and I was second or third or fourth in line. And here, the person in front of me was a very pretty girl, and I cut in front of her, and she pushed me away, told me to get back in line. And we struck up a conversation, and who was it? Very pretty little junior or sophomore by the name of Pearl Ossoff. And so we started seeing each other in between classes. She'd go to her locker to put away the books from the previous class and get the books for the upcoming class, and I'd be there to meet her, beat off a couple of other guys who were also there to greet her. And then I went on to Nebraska, and when she graduated, she started Creighton. Creighton it had been a boys-only school, and just that time, it must be about 1936, they started coeducational, and she was one of the early classes where they admitted females. So that's when I came back to Omaha. I keep telling people I came back because my dad was sick and I wanted to be here. I think maybe the main reason I wanted to, if Pearl was going to be in Omaha, I wanted to be here too. We got married in 1938, and as I mentioned, one of the wedding gifts was a year's free rent in the Glen Arlo apartments.
Jerry, what do you remember about that wedding?
About the wedding? Well, it wasn't quite the extravaganza that they are today. The wedding was on the 10th floor of the Blackstone Hotel, and there was no videotapes, and there was no big professional photographers. It was, I think they called it the garden room at the Blackstone. And it was a traditional Jewish wedding with the huppah and the it was Rabbi Goldstein. David Goldstein was the conservative rabbi in Omaha at the time. At the Bethel Synagogue on 20th and Dodge. And he performed the ceremonies. A small group, our close relatives, if I included going down to cousins and second cousins, we'd have filled the whole Blackstone. But there might have been 50 people in attendance.
Who was your best man?
That's a good question. I don't know if I'm ashamed to say I don't remember. Probably my brother Gordon, who was 4 years older. But there's no pictures of the wedding. We got one very grainy picture taken with the old box Kodak. Because as I say, in those days it never occurred to us that you should have a professional photographer and make big elaborate books and so forth.
What were you doing at that time for work?
Well, at that time I was an adjuster for an insurance company, and as I say, I was not making much money and gave it up. 1940, Andy Jean was born, our daughter, and I was offered a job, S. Rikus and Sons, an Omaha wholesaler of containers, primarily glass, jars, bottles, and so forth, to pharmaceutical and food industry and so forth. They had a large Omaha operation and a branch in Rock Island, Illinois, and Des Moines. And they wanted to get down into Kansas. So they offered me a job. They wanted to open a new branch in Wichita, Kansas. And it was much more attractive than what I had been doing. So I took that job and moved. I moved, leaving Pearl and Andy, who was just a baby at the time, in Omaha. I moved to Wichita, rented a house. I'm now up to 1940, probably close to the end of, what might be November, December of 1940. And I established a branch warehouse there with the assistance of Max Rikus and a few other Rikus employees. We got a big warehouse, brought in carloads of glass and bottles and items that people in that area were using. They already had many customers, but it was not, it wasn't practical to try to serve them out of Omaha, and that's the reason they wanted a branch in Wichita, so they could better serve them. And I rented a home and sent for Pearl and Andy Jean, and they came down. Then we shopped around and found a very nice home in one of the nice areas of Wichita called Eastboro. And it sounds, I don't think you could get a bathroom fixture now, but I think, as I recall, we paid $8,000 for it. That wasn't, with no mortgage, that was the cash price, $8,000 for a very nice, I think it was 2-bedroom with a full basement, nice lawn, in a very nice area of Wichita. And then, of course, we lived there until then the war started in, December of 41. But Rikus kept getting me deferments because the containers were being used by a very essential industry, the pharmaceutical and food industry. So I'd get bounced up to 1A, and Rikus, my draft board was still in Omaha, Rikers would get it bounced back to something less urgent. And so I would be content for 6 months, and then all of a sudden I'd open up the mail and I was back in 1A, and Rikers would get it bounced back to 2B or whatever it takes. This went on for several years, where I would be on the verge of being called, and then it would be rescinded, and I'd start breathing easy again because I had a wife and a child, small child, and I was not anxious to go. I'd go if called, but they'd have to call me. So this went on for several years, and along about 1944, I got a 1A draft card, and Rikers wasn't able to bounce it back to anything less than that. So I talked to Max and the Rikers officers, and they said, well, get a job with one of the aircraft factories, and maybe you can still manage the branch and do that too. You don't have to put in your full 8 hours at the branch. You can maybe do it with 2-3 hours and have a full-time job with one of the aircraft factories. So it was no trick getting a job, because with the shortage of skilled labor due to the war and the way the aircraft industry in Wichita was burgeoning, I applied at Cessna Aircraft, and immediately they put me a full-time worker in their, I was a pencil pusher in their shipping department. My job was to keep track of what came in and what went out and so forth. And I started about 4 in the evening and put in about a 10-hour shift. And then in the morning, I'd go down to the Rikers warehouse and spend several hours, and then back to Cessna Aircraft to the shipping department. That, as far as that 1A, I actually had to go to the post office on the appointed day, and there was a big bus, probably 30-40 passenger bus, and I got on the bus and got a window, and there was my little wife with baby in her arms waving me goodbye, and we all went up to Fort Leavenworth. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas was the induction for that area. And I was a very unhappy camper. So the next morning, why they called me and about 20 other fellas, they lined us up and they gave us our instructions and all, and told us to raise our hand and swear this and swear that. Oh, I have to go back a bit. Our son Bob was born in June of 1944. So at the time that they put me on the bus, I had 2 children. Andy was now 4 years old, and Bob was about 4 months old. So when I got up to Leavenworth and got sworn in, the next day they called me into the office and they told me that it was under the new regulations, I was now downgraded from 1A because I had 2 children. So Bob was my ticket out of the Air Force, out of the Army. And I had to sign a paper that I forgave all the rights and privileges that being a member of the armed force would have given me. And it's as if I had never been sworn in. And I went, I called my wife and told her that I was dismissed and I was now on my way home. And I had to find my own way home. I had to wait for it. They were running trains in those days, and I had to wait for a train. The government didn't, I was no longer a ward of the government. They were not going to give me transportation back to Wichita. But I was very happy to pay my own way. That was 1945. And then, of course, later that year, the war was over, and I wanted to, Pearl and I and the two children, we wanted to get back to Omaha, where her family was, where everybody I knew, my friends, my family were in Omaha. The war was now over. And my father-in-law, Hyman Ossoff, Pearl's dad, had a very active hardware store on the corner of 16th and Davenport, what is now part of the Federal building there. But at the time, he had the Ossoff Hardware and Sporting Goods, and he had talked to me about how would I like to come back to Omaha and be a partner with him, and while he took care of the hardware, I could take care of the sporting goods. Well, that sounded real good. Here was a nice, secure job, Omaha, which I knew well, and where we could get housing. We were able to find what we termed the bungalow, a little one-story house on just off of the corner of 51st and Capitol, where we had lived in an apartment earlier. And so I came back, and Dad Ossoff and I formed a partnership where I was a one-third partner, which I would pay out of the earnings. He was so generous, he just signed it over to me, and I didn't have the money to pay for that portion of the business. So he said, don't worry about it. The business is making money. You'll take out a living, and the balance will apply on your purchase of the partnership. And that's the way it worked. So that was 1945. And of course, it wasn't hard to sell items in those days. The trouble was getting a hold of them. If you could get a hold of the guns or the shotgun shells or the plumbing fixtures or practically anything in the sporting goods or the hardware line, all you had to do was have it and people would come and buy it. It was, to use an expression, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. We had taken not only the original store, which was one storefront, but the store next door was vacant. The original store was a one-story building on the corner, and a three-story building adjacent to it became available. So we rented that and broke through the wall so that we had a nice large store, half of which had a second and third floor, in which we were able to get some plumbing supplies from Bob Schwartz at Roberts Plumbing, toilet stools and tanks and sinks and faucets, which were they were hard to get items, and Bob was very good to us and gave us not only our share but probably more than our share, and we had those larger items up on the second floor. The third floor, we just had storage of surplus items and would bring them down to the sales floors as we needed them. Our partnership there, we went along until 1953, and we had an opportunity to take over a Safeway store. Safeway had several stores in Omaha at the time, and they were pulling out of Omaha, and one of the stores they vacated was at 44th and Dodge. It was a nice large store with a nice parking lot next door on Omaha's busiest street, and it was very attractive, and we were able to rent it from the owner, George Borton, on a favorable basis. So we opened the second store there in 1953. Meanwhile, my brother-in-law, Jerry Milder, who had married Pearl's younger sister, Frances, had joined, he had come in, he had a business in Lincoln called the Crib and Carriage, selling baby items. And they wanted to get back to Omaha. They were a young couple, and all the social activities were with their friends were in Omaha. And they wanted to get back in Omaha. So he came back also as a partner in the store when we opened the second store. And I was going to run the new store, and Dad and Jerry were going to run the store on 16th and Davenport. And it was an amicable partnership. We had a 10-year lease on the store at 44th and Dodge. You might recognize it. It later became a Jerry Leonard, a big and tall store run by Leonard Friedel after we vacated it at the end of our lease. Jerry, meanwhile, had an opportunity to go in to the Ranch Bowl. It was being built by our uncle, Zygmunt. And so one evening, while Jerry had Dad and I together and said he'd like to, he was going to have to leave the partnership, and he was going to form a partnership with Uncle Zygmunt, and build the Ranch Bowl on a dozen blocks south of Pacific on 72nd Street. So we told him, well, your investment that you had put into the business, why, it's all in guns, hammers, and saws. We can give you a bunch of those if you like, but cash we don't have. Well, we worked it out that we were able to raise the necessary funds and give Jerry his portion, and the partnership reverted back to where I had 1/3, Dad Ossoff had the 2/3. So then the government came along and they bought that property on 16th and Davenport, not only our building, but all the property. There was a bar next door, and then Ortman Bakery had a large bakery where not only they baked merchandise, which they sold to restaurants and others, but they also had, it was a lunch counter type of a thing, and very popular. Well, I mentioned one of the neighbors to the hardware store on 16th and Davenport was a bar, and then Ortman Bakery had a rather double space there, and then Maypier Clothing had also a rather large store where they sold moderately priced suits and work clothes, and they had a very active store. Then on the corner was a candy firm, Crystal Candy Company, as I recall, and it had a photography studio above, whose name I don't recall, and I should. Across the street was the Loyal Hotel, which you might remember, with Kaiser Bookstore and a barber shop, and the area was known as Film Row, and there was a FEPCO company there that made the posters that you used to see out in front of the theaters. I think it was the FEPCO was an abbreviation for Federal Entertainment Picture Company or something, run by a very energetic fella who, boy, he was a terrific salesman, called Walter Green. But then along Capitol Avenue, there were the offices of the film distributors, one of whom was Mort Ives, who later went on and started the first Village Inn in Omaha on 44th and Dodge. next to where we now had our Ossoff Hardware number 2. Things get intertwined here in Omaha. You know a person and you separate, and years later somehow or other you're thrown together again. But after 10 years at the new store there, we had closed the store on 16th and Davenport because the government took that entire block, and that's now part of the federal office building that's there on 16th Street. Then the store on 44th and Dodge, which was our only remaining store, and Dad Ossoff had now come out and joined me there, and Jerry had subsequently left and gone in with Zygmunt to build the Ranch Bowl. But we came upon, I guess you'd call it, hard times. Business was not enough for the two families. We were being beleaguered by some of the giants coming in, Target and Shopko and Westlake Hardware, and they just had us outgunned. And so our lease was coming up, and we decided to liquidate the store. We tried to sell it as a going business, and that wasn't very successful. I got together with a couple of friends, Phil Lazar, who at the time was running Lazarowitz Hardware on 16th Street, and specialized not in the what you commonly think of as hardware. He sold what they term builder's hardware. It's the locks and the hinges and everything that goes into the big buildings and houses and the type. But what you and I would normally think of as hardware store, they didn't have. That wasn't their line. So that fit in well because our store was primarily small hardware items and sporting goods. We were the agents for Wilson and McGregor sporting goods. We had 2 outside salesmen who called on schools. Then there was another person who I thought we might form a merger with, was Harold Bernstein. He ran the hardware department of the People's Department Store in Council Bluffs, and when the People's Department Store closed, he went off and built a very nice building right on Broadway and opened the People's Hardware Store. And I thought perhaps if the 3 of us all got together, Phil with his builder's hardware, Harold, who specialized, if you might term it that, mainly in large items, TV sets, refrigerators, gas stoves, things that neither Phil nor Ossoff's ever handled. I thought we might make one good store by merging the 3. And we got together and we crunched figures and we talked and we figured, and the upshot of it was we figured that we'd all 3 starve, we'd all 3 go broke, so we gave up that idea. So we called in professional liquidators. We liquidated the Ossoff Hardware, the remaining one on 44th and Dodge. The one department we had that was really just wildly successful, as our men were calling on schools with sporting goods, they were getting calls for trophies and awards and plaques. And we had begun to go to the proper sources, and that became quite an item within our store. We made it into a separate department, and business in that particular department was very good. It wasn't good enough to carry the entire store, but as a department it was very successful. So when we closed the store, I was a middle-aged guy with a wife and 2 children and no occupation. Not a good outlook. So I took the trophy department, I went over on Military Avenue near the well, you term it north of Hamilton there, and I bought a building and I opened up as Regal Awards. And along about that time, we had had quite a bit of the military out at SAC, Strategic Air Command, and Offutt Air Force Base. They would come in to OSIFs and buy, they had become good customers there. And the base and the Strategic Air Command headquarters had been very good customers of our trophy department. They had been we had become suppliers of a great many of their tournaments, their athletic tournaments, even some of their SAC-wide competitions, like the bombing competition and the missile competition. So that gave me a good start in the trophy business, and it took off, and along with all the other business, it was very successful. I opened up there in 1953 and operated it as Regal Awards until I retired in 1982. I became 65. And it was real good. I had a real good manager and real good employees, and I was able to not only take days off, but Pearl and I would go to California in the winter months for 3 months, and I got real spoiled. And but Pearl tells the story that I had made arrangements with them that every day at noon California time, which would be 2 o'clock in Omaha, I would call collect. There were no cell phones or anything in those days, and also where you could save a quarter. Why, I was not above doing exactly that. So at noon every day, as Pearl and I would either go to lunch or have lunch, I was to call Omaha, collect, and if they needed me, if there's anything that needed my attention, they would accept the collect call. But if not, why, there's no sense spending the money just to have a conversation, and they'd refuse the collect call. So Pearl laughingly tells the story that she could always tell whether they had accepted the call. She says that after I'd come back from making the call, if I had a hang dog look on my face, she knew that they didn't need me. And it bothered me that I could go away, leave a business, and it was running okay without me. But they did get along fine. It ran fine, and it was seldom that they had to accept my calls. There were no big crises that I can recall. But in 1953, I came back, and my general manager, who had lived in Des Moines and had been employed in the trophy business, and I had brought him to Omaha as my manager. He'd been with me about 10 years, told me that he was going to have to leave. His son had gotten into a bad gang here in Omaha and was on drugs, and they'd tried to cure him and get him out of it, and it wasn't working, and they had been advised the thing to do was to get him away from his associates, the gang he was hanging with. And he and his wife were going to move back to Des Moines and take their son with them. I offered him all kinds of inducements to stay because he was good at his work. But no, he was determined. He was leaving. He was going to Des Moines. So I started a search. I had to go back to work, which meant 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And after the pleasant life I had been leading, I didn't relish it. So I started looking for a new manager. And I had several talks with good candidates, but didn't find the person I wanted, or else wasn't able to offer them what they wanted, because several months went along and I wasn't able to find who the person to hire. And then it was through, I think, either my accountant or my lawyer. He told me that I should get in touch with a fellow by the name of Owen Neary. He had been vice president at Data Documents, which had just been bought out by a much larger firm, a national firm called Pitney Bowes. Data Documents made punch cards that you ran through a machine. You'd set the machine, I want all the boys from 18 to 25, and you'd throw all your cards in the machine, and they had been properly punched with all bits of information that it would separate what you wanted, all the boys from 18 to 25, or if you wanted everybody with an income from $10,000 to $20,000. The punches you'd set the machine to drop those cards. And the firm was called Data Documents, and was a very successful local firm. Their main account was the Mutual of Omaha, was their big account, but they had many others. And it was a very nice firm. Pitney Bowes had just recently bought them out, and the vice president, as I mentioned, Owen Neary, was now looking for a new position. So I contacted him, and we had some real serious talks over a matter of several months that he should come and be my manager. I offered him what I thought was an attractive salary and attractive benefits and all. And then I don't recall how long we had been negotiating, but he finally got to me and said, "Jerry, I don't want to come to work for you as manager, but if you'd consider selling me the business, I think I can raise enough and I'd like to buy the business. The business is very attractive to me, but I don't ever want to be fired again. So I'm not going to work for somebody. I'm either going to own the business or not." So it had never occurred to me. I was looking for a manager, not a buyer. I was 65 and enjoying my work, and was able to take long vacations. I was able to leave at noon for lunch and then to go home for the rest of the day. Nobody could ask for anything better. So I came home and I told Pearl that all my negotiations with Owen were coming to a sad end. He didn't want to work for me. He wanted to buy the business. So she says, "Why not? You're 65. It'd be a good time if, work up the proper price for the business, and if he wants to buy it, it sounds great to me. You not only can spend 3 months in California, you can spend as many months as you like." So as a result of that, we did very amicably arrive at a price. He bought the business, paying me over 5 years. Then he had rented the building. Then he started buying the building, which he bought over 5 years. The business is expanded. He now has 3 locations here in Omaha and 1 in Kansas City. In fact, it's almost embarrassing to me. I turned over a small business. From 1982, 24 years, he's made a much larger business. But I attribute it to just natural growth. But anyhow, he and I are close friends. He paid me carried out every obligation that he ever made to me, and we're good friends. And when I still go over to Regal Awards occasionally, drop in. He has an office there, and we visit. I've not only sold a business, but I made a good friend. And I'm happy to say he's doing extremely well. Well, where do we go from here?
I want to go back and talk about the grandparents.
About the grandparents. Okay, I think I told you, on the Mushkin side, my mother was the second of the oldest of 7 children. My grandfather, real kind gentle man, big husky guy. He could take a half a beef, and in those days the beef would hang on racks outside in the store. They didn't necessarily put them in the refrigerated case, which was refrigerated by ice, but they'd hang the front quarters, which they dealt in, they'd hang it on a hook right out in the area where they had their chopping blocks, just so it would be handy. And boy, he could handle it. He was a big husky guy. So he operated the meat market there. Then I mentioned on Friday nights we'd go down to get our week's supply of meat, and he'd cut me that hot piece of brisket corned beef that I've never since tasted anything that tasted quite as good as that chunk, not slice, chunk of corned beef. Then we'd go next door to Adler's, which had an odor all of its own. They had barrels of dill pickles and dried fish and all. They also had a penny candy counter, a glass counter with penny candy. But the odors were from the pickles and the fish and the barrels of sauerkraut. Everything wasn't in cans in those days. It was in large container, open containers. The pickles, I recall, was a probably 3.5, 4 foot tall barrel. That the pickles in there, you'd take a kind of a scoop, a cup with a long handle, and you'd scoop up as many pickles as you want. So we'd go to Adler's and buy some items there, some kosher items, and then we'd go to Himmelblum Bakery, and which was maybe a block away, and buy the bread and bagels and any bakery items we wanted. Then across the street and up a block, we'd go to Flax's fish store. And there they had what I later learned, to me at the time it was a fish tank, but I later learned it's one of those big cattle watering tanks. A big oval tank, maybe with sides 2.5 feet tall and 10 feet long and maybe 4 feet across, filled with water and with live carp and buffalo in it. And that was exciting. These great big fish and just this tank just full of fish. And Mother'd go over and she'd point to the fish she wanted, and one of the clerks or Mr. Flax would grab a net and net the fish, take it over, chop off its head, wrap it up. We'd take it home. That was filter fish. But that was our Friday nights at around 24th and Charles. Grandpa Gross, as I said, my dad was the youngest in that 7 children. And so Grandpa Gross was an old man by the time I came along. My dad was the youngest in his family, and I was the 3rd boy in my family. By that time, my grandpa, Michael Gross, was very elderly. I say very elderly. I'm probably older than, I'm sure now I'm much older than he was, and I might resent being called very elderly. You can call me elderly, but not very elderly. But I never did know what he did, because he had long been retired by the time I actually knew him. My Grandma Gross I never did know. She had already deceased by the time I came along. But I later learned that he had been a baker. Where his bakery was or what he baked, I don't know, but his occupation was given in the city records as a baker. And he lived with the children. At one time, he was with the Myers family, and then he'd be with the Katsky family, and then he'd be at our house. And he was a tiny, tiny gentleman, and he'd sit in our living room. He'd have a silk vest on and a brocade jacket and a box-type fancy embroidered yarmulke, and he'd have a big gold watch in his silk vest with a heavy gold chain on the other end, an emblem of some type or something. And he'd sit there smoking his Egyptian cigarettes. And he wouldn't take them out to knock the ash off. The ash would get longer and longer and longer. And it was fascinating to me. I'd have to watch him to see when the ash was going to fall off. And eventually it would. It would fall off and get on his silk vest, and he'd brush it off. Then he'd get up and he'd take out this watch about the size of it was a big heavy thing, and he'd wind it, and he'd wind it, and he'd wind it. And I thought, boy, is he ever going to get through winding that thing? Then he'd go into the living room, and where we had a clock on a mantel, and he'd set that clock with his watch. And I thought, what does he care what time it is? He's not going any place. All he would do was sit in that easy chair in the den there and smoke his cigarettes. But I guess he enjoyed what he was doing as I enjoy mine. I probably have some habits much worse than his. I don't smoke, but other habits I have. But he'd lived at our house for a couple of years, and then he'd live at one of the other children's houses. The Myers or the Katskys or the Art Mushkin's house. He'd bounce around. And all I remember, it would be shush. Whatever we were doing, he'd shush, Jerry, shush, shush. That was, but he was a nice guy. I shouldn't put him down. He's a better grandpa than I am. But that about covers, I think, what haven't I covered?
I want you to talk about your children.
Oh, well, the daughter I mentioned that we had 2 years after we were married. We were married in '38, and her birthday was in 1940. Andy, of course, she went to Dundee. By that time, we lived at 51st and Capitol. She went to Dundee School, and upon graduation, of course, like all of her friends and companions, she started Central High School, where she did real well. She was editor of the O Book. If you've got an O Book of, I don't know what vintage, why, you'll note that she was the editor. It's remarkable because she changed the format. They'd always had the pictures down one side with the names, and she jiggled them around. I haven't figured it out yet. She had the pictures on one side, the names on the other, and you go back, zigzag back and forth. You can't quite tell what name belongs to what person. And I think she got a little static on that, because the following year they went back to the old format of having the names under the pictures. But she did very well. She was on the register like many of her friends. And then upon graduation, she was interested in journalism. She'd been on the register, and she went to Northwestern. And I remember we went with her to Chicago, to Evanston, Northwestern University. And they don't have sororities per se, but they have dorms. Beautiful big brick homes, and this dormitory has that name, and the next dormitory has that name. And she went with two of her friends, Brodkey and Freeman. Sally Freeman, and Barbara Brodke. The three of them all went to Northwestern there. And we went with her to Chicago, then we returned home. And the next day our phone rang and there was Andy Jean crying. What had happened? Well, she got put in a dorm away from her two friends and she was unhappy. And so, like the father of that era, now I think they feel their children are a little more dependent. But I got on a train. It was an overnight to Chicago, and I went to Evanston. I remember there she was standing there. It happened to be a rainy day, just a dreary day, and she was standing there, and it was raining, and it was dreary, and she was crying. But anyhow, we finally got her settled down, and she moved into the dorm that she had been assigned, and still kept in touch with her friends, and had a very happy 4 years at Northwestern. Then, after graduation, she graduated a semester early. And so she came back to Omaha in mid-semester, so to speak, and got a job as a substitute teacher in Omaha. And I remember at that time I was in the store on 44th and Dodge, and we had 3 office girls there. And I remember the day she came running in the store, and from the front of the store, and it was a large store, she came running back. I was standing back in the office, and she shouts, Dad, I got hired. I'm going to get $20 a day. $20 a day? This was, I don't recall the years. But anyhow, I was paying my office girls probably about $30 a week. She comes running. She's a substitute teacher at $20 a day. I kind of think that didn't set too well with the girls in the office, but they loved her. She got along fine. Then I remember the day, by that time we had built a new house on 61st and Underwood. Actually, it's on the corner, and the street is named Parkwood Lane. 651 Parkwood Lane. The house is still there. Of course, we've since sold it. The people have kept it up very nice, and it's still a very lovely, lovely house. Inside, I know, and the outside, they've kept up the lawn and everything very nice. Incidentally, our neighbor, I was saying how things repeat themselves. When we were in when I was a youngster in North Omaha, Dave Blacker was the salesman for the North Omaha Booster. Well, when we built a house there on Parkwood Lane, Dave Blacker was our backdoor neighbor. He built a house on the corner of, I think it's called George Boulevard, or no, Dillon Drive is the next street. He had built a house on the corner of Dillon Drive, and we were backyard neighbors. But I remember the day that Andy and Barbara Brodke and Sally Freeman were in our house there on Parkwood Lane, and they were in the den, and they had a big map spread out on the floor, and all three were sitting on the floor studying the map. And I said, what's the problem? What's the deal? What are you gals doing? Well, they were looking for a place where they had now graduated, and they couldn't go out with these Omaha guys. They were undergraduates. They were too young for them. They hadn't graduated Nebraska yet, and those who had graduated had more or less gravitated away from Omaha. But for one reason or another, they felt their best prospects of finding a suitable husband was not in Omaha. They were looking for the proper place. And they finally decided that San Francisco was the place. That was the place where the most graduate students, single, were. And so that's where they'd go. So I don't recall the number of months, but all three went there. Sally got a job as a French teacher. Barbara, I don't recall her specialty, but Andy Jean got a job as a teacher in Daly City, which is a suburb of San Francisco, and the three of them roomed together. Barbara found a husband and got married, subsequently divorced. Sally found a med student, got married. That didn't last very long. Andy found a dental student who is now my son-in-law, Irv Green. And I'm happy to say they're still happily married, the parents of 4 children, grandparents of two children, 2 of my great-grandchildren. Andy had a career. She took journalism at Northwestern, and she started writing articles. And at one point there, she was a contributing editor on the staff of Ladies' Home Journal. And she had a 10-year contract for 6 articles a year for 10 years. And she was being paid very well for the articles. And I don't have to tell you, we've got every Ladies' Home Journal that her article appeared in. They're in our bedroom on a rack running across the length of the bedroom. Then after her contract was up, they didn't renew it, and Andy gave me the very logical reason. She said they're able to hire young, good journalism students at much less. She had worked her way up to where she was getting a lot of money for her stories. And she said they can replace me with much less expensive talent and then very talented people. So since then, she's just freelanced articles. She's had articles in Time and Newsweek and all the newspapers. She now lives in Denver, the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News, and she's still more or less doing that to this day. Actually, she married this Irv Green that I mentioned. She met in San Francisco. He later came back to Lincoln, Nebraska to take orthodontics, which was a very small class and very difficult to get into. But he was able to get into the orthodontics, which was headed by Sam Weinstein, an Omaha friend, their acquaintance of mine. And he was able to get into their orthodontics and was there for 2 years in Lincoln. Had 1 child while they were there. Then they moved to La Mirada, California, and eventually wound up in Cupertino, California, where he opened a dental office and practiced there for a good many years. They bought a nice home. The family had grown to 3 boys and an adopted girl. And Andy Jean was writing articles from Cupertino. And here, I'm just giving you a close estimate, but about 15 years ago, well, he was age 55. So Andy would have been about 53. Why they decided he'd retire. Their home had appreciated greatly in value. That was I'm reaching for the term. All the new computer companies were, in fact, Apple Computer is in Cupertino, and the property became very valuable. He sold his business to another dentist. They sold their home for a very inflated price because of conditions existing at that time, and they moved to Asheville, North Carolina. Not for any particular reason, but because they had read about it and seen videos and all. It just seemed like a great place to live. And I'll tell you, we visited them there while they were in Asheville, and it's right near it's at the base of the Smoky Mountains and the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's a town of about 65,000, and it's just a lovely, lovely place. They bought a home and were very content there. Their children, by this time, were gone. They were all adults. I think they were there for 8 years maybe. And meanwhile, one of their sons, Peter, their number 2 son, had gone from working for Apple in Cupertino. He had gone to Denver and married, and now had 2 children. Andy and Irv wanted to be with their grandchildren, so here just about 3 or 4 years ago, they sold their home in Asheville and bought a home in Denver, right near their son Peter and his family. And she's doing freelance journalism from there, primarily not for money. She has, with her credentials from Ladies Home Journal and the articles she's had published, she is able to be contacted by the Chamber of Commerce of maybe of a city or a organization. They want her to write an article, and meanwhile, they take wonderful trips, all where they're all comped. There's no charge. On the other hand, they also don't get paid, and her only obligation is to get an article about the hotel or the county or the show or the city, whatever the case may be, to get them some publicity, which she's able to do very easily. And her husband Irv has taught himself photography to where he's a very excellent photographer, has all the right equipment, and he goes along as the photographer. And they are leading a very happy life, taking 2 and 3 and even 4 trips a year, where all expenses are borne by the person who only request is that they get them some favorable publicity, which they're able to do. Our son Bob, 4 years younger than Andy, also went to Central High School after graduating Dundee, and he had taught himself magic and became or an amateur, let's say, magician. In fact, if he still has it, he won an award, cup as the Junior Magician of the Year in the Magic Society here in Omaha. And he'd be hired by Kiwanis or some little affair, having an affair. I'd have to drive him down with his equipment an hour ahead of time, and then he'd put on his show, and then I'd have to drive him back, and they would pay him $5 or $10. I really would have been glad to give him the money and just have him stay home, but he enjoyed it. At that time, the Omaha Park and Recreation Department they may still have it, they had what they called Showboat. They had 2 or 3 of them, and they were wagons, motor-driven, like a house recreational trailer, a house trailer, and they'd visit the various parks and put on amateur shows, and he was in a couple of those and got a little publicity. When he started Omaha Central, as many of you I'm sure know, they have what they call the road show. And each year, the students, often a club or sometimes individuals, will put on acts for the Central High Road Show, which would, I think, run at that time at least, I think it ran 3 nights, once a year. And Bob got on with his magic act. His assistant was Bunny Block, whose brother, Steve Block, is still here in Omaha, a very active lawyer and connected with the Enterprise Bank. Bunny was his older sister. That was Bob's assistant. And we have pictures of her in her cute little costume, and Bob is cutting off her arm or doing something. And he was in the road show all 4 years, got very well known, and ran for class president. And because of his activities and all, why he was elected class president. He did very well. He was a good student, and got some honors of which we were very proud. He was ready to go to university, and I made the bold statement that I'll send you to any university that you can qualify for. So he made applications, and bingo, he comes through with Yale. I wasn't quite prepared for that. That was a little above our station. But he went to Yale. He went there 4 years. He had been on the debating team at Central. He and a current Omaha attorney by the name of Danny Danberg. They were the pair, and they won a lot of debating honors while at Central. And in fact, they won the city championship and went on to Missoula, Montana, the national debating tournament. I think they placed 3rd. So I had him pegged as a debater, and debater, that means lawyer. So he went off to Yale, and after I think he'd been there a week or so, I got a phone call. Dad, I'm going to take pre-med. You mean pre-law? After all, debaters don't become doctors, debaters become lawyers. He said, no. I talked to my counselor. He says, I have an aptitude for medicine. Okay. So he spent his 4 years at Yale, incidentally, on the debating team. Incidentally, with, who is the guy that ran for president and got defeated? He was on the debating team, too. We got a picture of the Yale debating team of that year, and here Bob is with that candidate for president who didn't make it. The guy is married to the Hines woman, Kerry. Yeah, he's in the picture too. So if he'd become president, maybe Bob could have been Secretary of State or something. So then after Yale, he had to go to med school, and he went to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, of course, and took medicine. And along about that time, the Vietnam War had broken out. I think he graduated Yale in '66. So we're now around 68, 69. The Vietnam War had broken out, and he was in med school. And I recall vividly, kind of a thing you don't forget, he called me and said, Dad, we're all talking about the draft and so forth. The draft was run, they were picking a number, and if that was your birthday, that was how they selected you. And I don't know if I've got a rather low number. That was, I don't recall, but he was at a point there where his birth date and all, where the draft may go that far, or on the other hand, by the time they got to that number, they may have enough draftees that he would never be called. And he says, but there's, from Congress, there's a Berry plan. And the Berry plan is that if you'll commit yourself to 2 years service after you graduate, they will permit you to graduate. He said, should I do that? And if I do, I will have to serve 2 years in the military upon graduation, which I hate to waste 2 years after I'm graduated medicine. He said, on the other hand, if I'm don't sign up under the Berry plan, I'm subject to the draft, and with my number, it's very possible that I may be drafted. So we kicked it around, and we decided to go the Berry plan route was the best. He did sign up under the Berry plan, which assured him that he could finish his medical career at Philadelphia there at the University of Penn. And incidentally, he never did get, they never did get up to his number, but upon graduation he owed the military 2 years. He went into the Air Force, got sent to Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is just like a country club. It's just a beautiful base on the coast, the Pacific coast of California, up near, well, there's a town, Santa Maria, a little north of the base. But I visited the base several times while he was there, and it's just a beautiful base. They had a brand new 30-bed hospital, but there, another crisis. He arrived at the base. He was married, and he had married a California girl in the meanwhile. And he called me up and he said, Dad, there's no housing. The housing on the base is all filled. And I said, well, you'll just have to go to Santa Maria and rent an apartment or something. And he very unhappily said, yeah, I guess that's the case. I think he went in as a lieutenant because as a college graduate and medical officer, he went in as a first lieutenant. And next day he called me up, Dad, I've got housing. I said, where's that? Well, they discovered there's a rule that as a medical officer, I must live on the base. He's, I can't rent an apartment in Santa Maria if I wanted to. And all of a sudden they found a nice house for me and his wife and his wife at the time. They later had a baby. So he served his 2 years there at Vandenberg, and his job was evaluating people who were being returned from Vietnam. He complained about the fact. He said, I have to evaluate them in 15 minutes. My appointments are 15 minutes apart. 4 people every hour. They come in, first of all, I'm not a psychologist. I got to sit there and decide whether they go back to Vietnam, whether they go to a hospital, or whether they get discharged. And he says, in 15 minutes, I just can't do the job the way it should be done. But that was it. That was the structure. So he followed it through, and he spent 2 years at Vandenberg. Then he served an internship in Torrance, California, Harbor General Hospital, which is a city in itself. It's a giant county hospital in Torrance, California, a town, maybe 50 miles south of Los Angeles. But there he decided on his specialty. He's a gastroenterologist, which I couldn't even spell it, but he moved after graduating his internship there at Harbor General. He went to Los Angeles. He joined a firm of 4 gastroenterologists, one of whom has Omaha connection. It was Gary Gitnick, whose brother, Jerry Gitnick, was a lawyer and judge here in Omaha. But Gary was a very prominent gastroenterologist in L.A., and Bob went in as a junior of the firm. He was with him for 2 years. Then he decided he wanted to be on his own. He opened his own office, and no associates. He has his own office, and that's the way he likes it. He might have gotten it from his old man, but he said he was in an office with the four where there was a partners of 4, and they were constantly bickering about, I brought in more business than you did, and you took more days off than I did, and you brought in more money than he did. And he says he doesn't want it. He's in an office by himself in Culver City, California. There's a Brotman Memorial Hospital there where one time he was chief of staff, and he's a very well-known and respected member of there. He's on the staff of that and Cedars of Lebanon hospitals, and divides his time between them. Has a nice home in Westwood with a wife. And from his first marriage, all doctors have at least 2. From his first marriage, he had 2 children. Then there was a divorce. Children stayed with the mother. And Bob later, after a couple of years being single, remarried. And his current wife, they have 2 lovely daughters. One 17, who, strangely enough, is going to start Northwestern in a week or 2. And a daughter 15, who lives at home. And that's the story of Bob, the gastroenterologist his home is in Westwood, a nice area of Los Angeles. So I am sitting here in Regency. My 2 kids are nicely settled, and that's about the story. Well, I've given you pretty much the history of the Gross family, including my dear wife, who we've been married 68 years. We got married in 1938 at the little wedding that I described. And we've had tough times and good times, but during them all, why, we loved each other and respected each other. 68 years of marriage. The kids were real proud. Andy and our son-in-law Irv, they're led a fine life, fine family. Their oldest boy, Doug, he's single. He's got a very fine job. He's vice president of human relations at the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. Next in line, Peter works for a Thompson Corporation, a New York Stock Exchange company. He takes information and puts it into computer language for them, and it's a service purchased by hospitals and medical doctors and so forth, where rather than buying a library full of medical books, they can log into the company for which he works, and just any volumes of information more than you could actually put in books, is immediately available to them through their computer. And he and his crew are the ones who take medical language and make it computer ready. Next is Michael, who lives in Boston. Just recently went through a divorce, but it's now come to an ending, maybe even a happy ending. And he works for Bose Radio Company. And there again, he has a crew, he tells me, of 5 people, and they, number one, buy advertising space and write advertising copy for Bose, as well as go to certain organizations and things and make speeches trying to tell the people about the company. I've heard their ads on radio, television, newspapers, magazines, but I didn't realize, he tells me it's a company with 10,000 employees, of which he's one. The daughter, Lindy, they adopted her as a 2-year-old from Korea, and she has remained single, and when the rest of the family left Cupertino, which is almost a suburb of San Jose, she stayed behind because she had a job at a very fine hotel there in downtown San Jose, where she's in the reservations department. She's happy with her work. In fact, she's a happy child. So that takes care of Andy and Irv's children. Bob, I mentioned, he had 2 children from his first marriage. I didn't mention, however, in Andy's family, Peter, who lives in Denver, has 2 children. Andy's grandchildren, and of course my great-grandchildren. They have a 7-year-old Samantha, a darling little girl. Then they have a 5-year-old boy, who he's into everything. If you want to know anything about baseball, just get him to tell you. He'll have the answers. If ever he goes on Jeopardy, if the question is baseball, he's a sure winner. Then Bob, living in Los Angeles, he's still active at his medical practice. He just celebrated his 62nd birthday. Has some lovely friends, mostly connected with the medical, doctors and so forth. And whenever we go to LA, he has a dinner at his home and has them over, and through him I've become friends with a lot of them. They call me Grandpa, and they're I think of them as close friends as well as his friends. From his first marriage, he had a daughter, Julie, who in turn, she's married to a lawyer. She has 2 children. The older, Parker, is now about 4 years old, and then they have another son, Liam. I'll spell it for you, Liam, Liam, a little unusual, but he's a pretty little guy of about 1 year at the moment. That's the 2 children there. Her younger brother, Andrew, Bob's son from the first marriage, and the only one to carry on the family name of Gross, and that's a heavy obligation because my 2 older brothers had no one in their family to carry on the name. Elmer had no children, and Gordon had 2 daughters. So Andrew, Bob's son from the first marriage, is the guy who's got to carry on, perpetuate the Gross lineage. Andrew graduated Emory with a law degree and a MBA degree. Came back to Los Angeles and is now working for a land developer. He's the vice president in charge of development with in my eyes, a large developer, but as giant developers go, he'd be middle-sized. But they have quite a few shopping centers and subsidized housing projects around LA, of which he's justly proud. From the second marriage, Bob and his wife Margie have two daughters. I mentioned the older is going to start in Northwestern. Allison, she's interested in journalism. She'd gone to a private school there. I don't recall the name because they went to one school under elementary, and now this is she graduated from what is comparable to a high school. But Allison is starting Northwestern. She's interested in journalism, and she got in what I understand is the very prestigious McGill College, which is evidently in the journalism world has quite a reputation. She's very excited. And we're excited that she'll be in Evanston, a mere 500 miles, instead of LA, 1,500 miles. The other daughter, the younger daughter, Caroline, is 15, and she's going to a private school there. Again, the names have changed because in elementary it was one school, and now in high school it's another. But she's 15, so in 2 years she'll take up where Allison left off. She's very excited because she'll soon be 16, and Allison can't take her car to school, so she'll inherit Allison's car, which and probably have a room to herself. And I'll tell you, I'm real proud of all my children and grandchildren. The great-grandchildren are not old enough to have gotten into trouble, but I'm sure they'll lead a good and decent life as they grow up. Andy and Bob, I love them to death. They've never given us an ounce of worry, never given us cause any pain. And I can say the same for the grandchildren. And these three boys, they're just good pals of mine. I think they love me, and I sure love them. Lindy, the daughter, I don't see her as often, and I don't know, maybe with a granddaughter, you're not as close as a grandson, but I love her equally. And then to pass on to Bob, Julie, the daughter of his first marriage, the oldest of his 4 children. She's just a sweetheart. She was here for my birthday here just last week. She's as sweet as they come. And her husband too. Andrew, he just married a very sweet gal. We were in Los Angeles a month ago to attend their wedding. We've known her for several years that they've been keeping company, but Andrew's a bright guy. I'm sure he's destined for great things. We love him, and his wife, his new wife, his wife of 1 month. Tamara, I know we'll love her too. We've loved her when he was just a girlfriend, and we'll love her as a granddaughter. Bob's two youngest, Allison and Caroline, they're just sweet. They hang on to me. If I come within 10 feet, they grab me and start kissing me and hugging me. And how can you not like that? How can you not be flattered by that? I love them to death. So I've told you that's the story of the Grosses and the Grosses progeny, and right on down the line. You're right up to date. I was 90 2 days ago, so I'm now 90 in 2 days, and another 10 years I'll be 100. How can you beat that?